Stellantis, a name that sounds more like a pharmaceutical company than a car manufacturer, and yet this single corporation controls Vauxhall, Fiat, Alfa Romeo and Maserati here in the UK, along with Peugeot, Citroën, Jeep and a dozen other badges you'll recognise from the school run and the motorway. For years, this company looked untouchable, a European giant built from the merger of Fiat Chrysler and the French PSA Group. A business that once posted profits so large that shareholders were practically popping champagne corks in the boardroom. Then, almost overnight, it started falling apart. Let's start with the number that's been floating around. £19 billion. That's roughly what Stellantis lost across its most recent financial year, once you convert the figures out of euros. €22.3 billion to be precise, wiped off the books in a single 12-month stretch. To put that into some kind of perspective, that's not a company having a rough quarter. That's a company that has fundamentally misjudged where the market was heading and is now paying for it in the most brutal way a business can, in cold, hard losses. And here's the thing that makes this so strange for anyone who's followed the car industry over the last decade. Stellantis wasn't some struggling underdog. Back in 2023, this was one of the most profitable car manufacturers on the planet. €18.6 billion in net profit that year alone. Executives were being paid enormous bonuses. The chief executive at the time, Carlos Tavares, had just secured himself a pay rise of over 50% based on how well the company was supposedly performing. Within about 12 months, he was gone. Resigned under pressure, with the board effectively pushing him out the door as the wheels came off. So what actually happened? Because this isn't just one bad decision. It's a pile-up of them, one after another, each one making the next one worse. Start with the UK dealer network, because if you live anywhere in Britain, this is where you'll have actually felt it. Vauxhall showrooms that had been open for decades, quietly shutting their doors. Fiat dealerships disappearing from town centres where they'd been fixtures since your parents were buying their first cars. Alfa Romeo, always a slightly niche choice in this country anyway, becoming almost impossible to find outside a handful of major cities. And Maserati, well, Maserati in the UK has essentially become a ghost brand. A handful of showrooms left, stock sitting unsold, and dealers openly questioning whether it's even worth keeping the badge on the wall. Now, the Luton story is probably the one that made the biggest headlines, and it's worth slowing down on this one, because it wasn't just a factory closing, it was 120 years of history ending. Vauxhall had been building vehicles in Luton since 1905. Generations of families in that town worked there. Fathers, sons, grandsons, all clocking in at the same site their relatives had worked at decades earlier. And then, in November of 2024, Stellantis announced they were shutting it down. 1,100 jobs gone. The final vehicle, a Vivaro van, rolled off that production line in March the following year, and that was it. A century plus of manufacturing heritage finished. The union response was furious, and honestly, understandably so. Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, called it a betrayal. Her word, not mine. And pointed out that this was a workforce that had hit every target the company had ever asked of them. They weren't underperforming. They weren't the problem. The plant itself had even been promised a future producing electric vans. Just months before the closure was confirmed, workers were told one thing and then handed redundancy notices not long after. Stellantis blamed a few different things for this. They pointed at the UK's zero-emission vehicle mandate, the rule requiring a certain percentage of new car and van sales to be fully electric each year, 22% for cars, 10% for vans, at the time. The company argued this was squeezing their business model, forcing them to either sell EVs at a loss or pay penalties for missing the targets. Whether you buy that explanation or see it as a convenient excuse, that's really up to you. But it's the official line they gave, both to the press and to the government ministers who were pushing back on the decision. And it wasn't just Luton. Production was consolidated instead at Ellesmere Port in Cheshire, with £50 million pumped into that site to turn it into the group's electric van hub, which on paper sounds like a sensible restructuring move. Concentrate resources in one place rather than spreading them thin. But for the workers in Luton, that £50 million investment somewhere else wasn't much comfort. And for a lot of industry watchers, it raised a bigger question. If Stellantis is having to make these kinds of consolidation decisions in the UK specifically, what does that say about how confident they actually are in the British market long term? Let's talk about the brands individually now, because each one is dealing with its own version of this crisis, and they're not all identical. Vauxhall is the one most people in the UK feel connected to, simply because it's been part of British motoring for so long. But sales have been sliding. The brand has struggled to keep up with newer, cheaper competitors, particularly from Chinese manufacturers that have been flooding into the UK market with electric and hybrid options at prices Vauxhall simply can't match. There's also been a persistent issue with product timing. New models arriving late, or not quite matching what buyers actually want at that moment. In an industry where being 6 months behind can mean losing an entire sales cycle to a rival, that's been costly. Fiat has a slightly different problem. It's always leaned on being the quirky, characterful city car option. Think the 500, small, stylish, a bit of Italian flair for people who didn't want something as bland as everything else on the road. But that segment of the market has been squeezed hard by electrification costs and by changing buyer habits. Smaller cars carry thinner profit margins to begin with, and when a company is trying to claw back losses everywhere else, the temptation is always to deprioritize the models that don't make much money, even if those are the models people actually love. Alfa Romeo has probably had the toughest identity crisis out of all of them. It's a brand built entirely on emotion, on the idea of Italian passion, on a heritage of racing and design that goes back generations. But emotion doesn't pay the bills if the volumes aren't there. Alfa's UK sales numbers have been genuinely tiny compared to almost anything else on the road, and there's been persistent speculation, on and off for years now, about whether the brand can survive as a standalone name inside the Stellantis portfolio, or whether it eventually gets folded into something else, or quietly allowed to fade. And then there's Maserati, which is arguably in the worst position of the four. This is a brand that's supposed to represent Italian luxury, sitting up near Ferrari and Lamborghini in terms of image, but without anywhere close to their sales volumes or profitability. Maserati has struggled for years to find a clear identity within a giant corporate group that also owns budget brands like Fiat and mainstream brands like Vauxhall. Luxury brands generally need enormous investment to stay competitive, in design, in technology, in exclusivity, and when the parent company is hemorrhaging billions elsewhere, that kind of investment tends to be one of the first things cut. So why did all of this happen at once? Because it wasn't really one crisis. It was several colliding together at the worst possible moment. There's the EV transition itself. Stellantis, like a lot of legacy manufacturers, poured enormous sums into electrification, betting that demand would ramp up quickly. It didn't, at least not at the pace they were expecting. New leadership at the company openly admitted this after the fact, describing the losses as coming from, in their words, overestimating the pace of the energy transition. That's a fairly remarkable thing for a company to say out loud. Essentially admitting they built an entire strategy around a prediction that turned out to be wrong. Then there's the tariff situation, particularly around trade with the United States, which added billions more in costs on top of everything else. There were also enormous one-off charges, Write-downs on cancelled vehicle programs, changes to how the company accounts for warranty provisions, and restructuring costs tied to workforce reductions across Europe. All of that got bundled together into one brutal set of financial results, and the dividend to shareholders was suspended entirely as a result. Add leadership chaos on top of all that. Carlos Tavares out the door under pressure. An interim executive committee running things for months while the board searched for a replacement. Then Antonio Filosa eventually brought in as the new chief executive, tasked with somehow steering this enormous, sprawling company back towards stability. That's not an easy job under any circumstances. Doing it while multiple factories are closing, multiple brands are losing relevance, and the balance sheet is bleeding red, that's about as difficult as it gets in the automotive world right now. For UK customers and enthusiasts, what does all of this actually mean going forward? Well, it's worth being realistic about it. Fewer dealerships means longer journeys for servicing, less local competition on pricing, and in some cases, brands simply becoming harder to buy new at all in certain regions. It also raises real questions about resale values. If a brand's future feels uncertain, that uncertainty tends to filter down into used car pricing too, because buyers get nervous about parts availability, warranty support, and long-term reliability of the whole ownership experience. There is a more optimistic read on all of this, to be fair. The second half of the most recent financial year did show some improvement, revenue growth returning, industrial cash flow moving in a healthier direction. New leadership has been talking about resetting the product plan around what customers actually want, rather than chasing electrification targets that the market wasn't ready for. Whether that translates into a genuine turnaround for Vauxhall, Fiat, Alfa Romeo and Maserati, specifically here in the UK, that's still very much an open question. What's clear is that this isn't a temporary blip. This is a company that grew too fast, bet big on a transition that moved slower than expected, and is now going through the kind of painful correction that tends to leave permanent scars. Closed factories, thinned-out dealer networks, and brands that may never fully recover the presence they once had on British roads. Whether Stellantis manages to stabilize things from here, or whether this is just the beginning of a longer decline, that's the story that's going to keep playing out over the next few years, and it's one well worth keeping an eye on if any of these four badges have ever meant something to you.